Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron of Sidious. And today we're here with a Storyteller's review. You can look at the title of this video to see which work we're going to be reviewing. 4 years ago, I joined Substack in order to talk shop and utilize the space as a staging ground to share some of my genre fiction material. This was much the same basic reason why back in 2007 I started my own YouTube channel in the first days of my time as a storyteller. I would, over the years, put together some videos and essays that strayed outside of genre fiction, yes, but by and large I have remained pretty much straight down the line a storyteller, occasionally shifting gears to review the works of other authors as well. Most of my reviews are of books by mid to large authors, though I have done reviews of indie works as well, and truth be told, I prefer to cover them. Sometimes I've opted to review the works of those individuals because I enjoy those indie authors' personalities, and I'm hoping that they can get some much-deserved coverage. A few times, though, I'll admit, I have found some of these indie authors to be smug, self-aggrandizing worms, and I've wanted to see if their enormous egos were warranted in any way, stretch, or form by the skills displayed as storytellers. Of the various egomaniacs, only two have proven to actually be rather talented as authors, those two being one Ms. Bronwyn Winter Phoenix, who is personally, I find, rather insufferable, yet she knows her way around a horror story, and she is quite talented, and Scott Burtness, who would root for all Americans who are ideologically to the right of Chairman Mao to be thrown into camps, even if there is no good charge or due process given them. But he can weave a wickedly wonderful fantasy yarn, and he does actually have a decent sense of humor. I've been following the Substack posts of one John Arroz for about 4 or 5 months now, a sci-fi novelist and comic book / graphic novel creator. One of his own YouTube videos was in my suggested feed, thanks YouTube algorithm. I watched some of these videos and thought he had some valid points to make, and I followed that through his profile to his Substack, though it's actually an associated Substack called Fandom Pulse. It took a little while, but between his Substack and his YouTube channel, especially his YouTube channel, it eventually became painfully obvious to me that Mr. Arroz has an ego the size of Cleveland. When one goes through his YouTube video list, it's difficult to see if that ego is warranted, because he has no free material out there to offer a sample of his wares and what he can work up, relying instead on a kind of bog-standard anti-woke set of smack-talking talking points and side-mouthed insults and insinuations at the works of other people. While this can be entertaining by itself, a careful read or listen to his megrims leaves one wondering, why aren't there any specifics when he lobs these critiques and insults at other authors? Or one could wonder, why are those few specific examples always a sort of cut and paste impression from other creators? And so I have opted to bite the bullet and buy a copy of one of Mr. Arroz's works, specifically to see if his own inflated sense of cocksure superiority is well earned or not. If it is, I'll say as much and move along. If it isn't, well, then it's about time that someone openly pushed back on this narcissistic blowhard and sent him hurtling back to reality. And so it is, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, that I present to you John Dellarose's For Steam and Country, published in 2017 by Superversive Press. A quick sidebar regarding Superversive. Superversive Press is self-identified, or was self-identified, as a conservative publishing house for genre fiction in science fiction and fantasy. However, Superversive folded in the year 2020. They never ultimately garnered a large enough footprint or market share to remain solvent and operational within the publishing industry. This isn't a shock, because publishing is difficult to maintain a footprint in if you are a small publishing operation. So I went through and I read the book, and I took notes on negative points and positive points, and I gotta say, by the time I was through with the work, I didn't have a whole lot of positive notes to take up. So let's just take a look at a couple of the notes I've got. To begin with, we've got, holy buddy, did Mr. Delarose think that sloppily changing a few letters in the name Gilgamesh and making the giant's name Galgmarsh was some kind of clever maneuver? Anybody familiar with Judeo-Christian mythology, or really epic poetry and mythology of any sort, is going to know the name Gilgamesh and the legend thereof. They're going to be able to put two and two together, because most people who spend any amount of time reading genre fiction, generally speaking, aren't idiots. Still, the deployment of this didactic little parable at the beginning of the story with a fairy tale, it's not the worst way to open a story in the genre of either fantasy or sci-fi, or, in the case of this book, the subgenre known as steampunk. Next note was another negative. Quote, showered my mother and me in exotic gifts. No, Zyra. And by Zyra, I'm referring to the story's narrator and primary protagonist. The proper syntax here and grammar would be mother and I. Perhaps Mr. Delarose would know that if an editor had caught it for him. There were several times throughout reading this book, though, where I had to wonder if Superversive employed any editors, or if they simply told Mr. Delarose to make certain to edit himself. Now, early on, the tone was set fairly firmly. From the airship's description and title of the work, we've definitely got ourselves set in the steampunk subgenre, which this subgenre tends to be infused with steam engine power machinery, low-level magic and or alchemy, and a high sense of adventure. There are several times where Mr. Delarose is repetitive early and midway through the work. He uses the same descriptors several times on a singular page. For example, Zyra tells readers that her dad disappeared 2 years ago, but she mentions this twice in the same 4 paragraphs or 1 page, only about maybe 7 or 8 pages into the book. It's not a good sign. Next negative note, pretty quickly after that, Toby, the pet ferret. Here's a trope of the steampunk subgenre that is so mind-bogglingly commonplace and overdone that there are Etsy stores selling stickers and so-on patches featuring these critters in leather goggle helmets of the steampunk visual aesthetic. This is frankly overdone. We've seen it 1,000 times, if we've seen it at all, in the steampunk subgenre. There was one part early on that was kind of a plus and a negative. It's definitely character defining to establish that Zyra has been running her family farm on her own for 2 years since the last time she saw her father. That can provide a good amount of characterization and give us a sense of what her state of mind has been up to the starting exciting events of the adventure that she ultimately goes on. But do you mean to tell me that this was from the ages of 14 to 16? I'm going to have to press X to doubt. He thinks there's a touch of deus ex machina here to wave off any kind of misfortune that she might have come up against, or else there's some old-fashioned Mary sewage going on here for Zyra. Later on, there is some clarification that she occasionally received help from her neighbors, the Gentrys, but we'll get back to more of that later, because she also mentions a few times that she enjoyed, or not enjoyed, but she got her earnings from the Plains Road Village market. Early on, she indicates that she was going to market, that she was the one doing all of the operations, doing the planting, doing the tending to the crop, and then the harvesting, and taking the produce to market. But then later on, she says that Mr. Gentry took her goods to market. There's contradiction in the establishment. This is an inconsistency. And it's not the only inconsistency of past established facts and patterns that Delarose butts right up against throughout the story. So there's also another inconsistency early on in that Zyra thinks, quote, my parents' untimely demise. I thought that she had already established that her mother passed away and that her father had disappeared on one of his adventures and not yet returned. But at this point in the story, there had not yet been any confirmation that he was dead, which defies a prior setup. This is a bad sign early on. Again, an editor should have cleaned this up, because she doesn't have confirmation yet at this point in the story. One uptick, the newcomer duo of Mr. Gearsmith and Captain Von Cravat. By the way, I hate the names in this book. They're cartoonish, just over the ridge cartoonish. But they received colorful, yet not overwrought descriptions at their introduction, though the captain's uniform sounded a little ersatz SS leather fetish for my liking, but, you do you, JDA. Especially the clockwork designs on the gentleman's vest. Again, it's an obvious subgenre nod and trope, sort of forgivable, but then he pulls out and uses a monocle to address Zyra von Monocle. Not only is this repetitive, but my God, if you are going to tip your hat that far into a trope, remember to come up for air. That's just unacceptably sloppy. So, once he said, this is Captain Von Cravat, I found myself thinking, well, when are we going to see Lieutenant Dickey or Corporal Kerchief showing up? Is anyone supposed to take this book seriously at this point with names like this? It really was a struggle to continue reading this work without just laughing and saying, this is terrible. There's also some inconsistency of environments, such as when Matthias, when Gear Clock enters Zyra's home and takes a look around and gives a kind of a stuffy look, when he should have seen from the previously described damage from the earthquake that there wasn't much of a bang-up, well-to-do home, not only from the size of the exterior, but she had described that there was a hole in the roof that went through the kitchen. So part of the home's interior should have been visible from the outside. Again, inconsistency of the environment. Not a good sign. So, yeah, just there's a lot of sloppiness going on. But the next bit I'm going to come to here is that when it comes to descriptors, um, the world building, there's just a huge flaw in the logic early on with the horseless carriage, its design. The steam stack is sort of this pedestal design, and it's shoved right down the center of the horseless carriage vehicle. This seems like a bit of a terrible and illogical vehicle design, given the apparent danger of the heat that it churns out, and there's no note of there being seatbelts or restraints. So you've also got another immediate big oof in the negative. Zyra says, quote, about Captain Von Cravat. These are her exact words of dialogue. She sure makes decisions quick and is good at hiding. Nobody talks this woodenly, this artificially, not even marionettes. And Von Cravat spotting hostiles with eagle vision at night in the woods or whatever, when Zyra sees no sign of these Winrath soldiers up the road. Frankly, that's a bit of an OP stereotype, mama hard-ass anime bitch boss moment for this character. She's kind of a joke and a half. And the first scene where we have these Wyranth soldiers, the patrol scene, it just doesn't work for me on any level. For starters, the patrol unit seems awfully undisciplined, for one. For two, the blatant focus on the blue vials, the things that the soldiers refer to as ether, that is a trumpet blaring, honking MacGuffin so loud that the audience should be educated on whether or not they have tinnitus afterwards. The clumsy soldier who lost the stopper on his vial, he's the one who said ether out loud, thus naming the MacGuffin in front of what are apparently civilians. These are well-off civilians, by the way, from the look of the vehicle. And these soldiers don't question these well-off people why they're traveling in the dead of night. This is sloppy, damn sloppy. And frankly, it comes across as overbearingly contrived. So let's get down and skip over. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 other pages of just sideline observations like this, most of them not good. At one point I was torn on whether or not I was going to bother finishing this work because, you see, I've dealt with fevered egos like John Delarose before, and I knew without a doubt that if I had just given up and walked away and said, I'm not going to bother, I would have never heard the end of it, either from myself or from those egotists. They would have just said, well, what do you know? You have nothing to say. You didn't even finish it. Well, I buckled down and suffered through the rest of this piece of trash. So I'm going to now get to the actual standard review, much in the style of the other reviews that I've put together over the last few years. We'll begin with characters. 2.5 out of 10. There's really no polite way to put this, so I'll be blunt. This story's narrator and primary protagonist is such a walking bag of fluff and entitlement and naivete that I wouldn't piss on her to put her out if her head were on fire and I had no other source of liquid on hand. Zyra von Monocle, and again I hate these character names, is at turns naive and self-destructively brash, particularly when she nearly destroys the airship that is her main inheritance because she's just too eager for adventure and thinks, I'll figure it out as I go, because that's how a farmer does things. A farmer learns by doing. That's an exact quote from the story. Well, yeah, but a farmer also doesn't risk their own lives and the lives of everybody around them by doing something stupid. Let's not overlook the various moments where Zyra's character requires a suspension of disbelief that only a toddler or a simpleton could achieve. For fully a quarter of the book, readers are expected to believe that a 14 to 16-year-old girl on her own ran and maintained her family farm with only occasional help from her closest neighbors. None of the primary characters in For Steam and Country rise above the depth of archetype, outside of, maybe barely a shallow puddle that comes to your shin, and outside of a couple of blatantly contrived scenes that attempt to offset the bare bones personality of these characters, especially the soldier Captain Von Cravat. She has about as much personality outside of a couple of moments as a plywood board. What makes this worse is that with Von Cravat, she comes across, as I said before, as some kind of all-skilled boss bitch stoic. Exactly the kind of character who folks like John Delarose are constantly making a stink about, ruining our modern-day films and television shows. Most of the less vital yet center-stage cast have a shallow wooden portrayal throughout the story and serve more as window dressing than to be unique, fully developed persons. Much like Tekken 3's Mokujin, they move around on their own, but there's nothing much that makes them notable and unique. As for character dialogue, there's more than a couple of moments where I actually had to catch myself asking out loud, who talks like this? It's unnatural. As a parting note for this section, it should be noted that one thing was done well by John Delarose in terms of his aims with this cast. There are clear delineation marks between protagonists and antagonists. There is light and dark, good and evil. There aren't many shades of gray with this cast, with the exception perhaps of Marcus, who, spoiler alert, because I think this was intentional on Delarose's part to convey the sense that a traitor is the most dangerous person when they can effectively fool you into trusting them. That alone actually manages to earn half a point by itself. Plot, 4 out of 10. For Steam and Country doesn't have a bad or completely boring or uninteresting plot, as it were, though it is a relatively bog standard as far as coming-of-age sci-fi fantasy goes. Let's do a kind of generic breakdown of what this is, because we've seen this sort of story before. Naive, rural young adult is pulled out of their daily drudgery to answer the call to adventure. They inexplicably are called upon to save their country and or the world from maniacal powers. They do so through the power of friendship or family or love. They pick up previously unearned skills or abilities or allies somewhere along the way. End of story. Trite and overdone. World building mechanics, 2 out of 10. While reading For Steam and Country, I found myself on several occasions wondering, has John Delarose ever played a tabletop role-playing game? Or an RPG video game? Or watched fantasy or sci-fi films or shows? Or has he read the genre of steampunk as a subgenre, at all? Now that last one's perhaps a bit of an unfair question, because he obviously has. How else, after all, would he be able to so clumsily deploy so many tropes of the steampunk and fantasy genres? Perhaps he should have taken a World Building 101 seminar instead of trying to find out how to throw a good right hook at his wife. Anyway, tropes are not a problem on their own. I have made that clear, and I've made that point in several other reviews and essays. Where John Delarose shits his pants worse than an incontinent 90-year-old after a trip to Taco Bell is his sloppy and uninspired use of tropes. There's nothing that's even vaguely original or interesting or unique in his tweaking of the tropes that are offered up. They're bog standard. The result is confused geography, antagonists that are straight out of central casting, and nods to libertarian political philosophies that are beyond laughable when they're held up to the rest of the genre for comparison. And I already referred you earlier to my note about the horseless carriage design and its failings. Technique, 3 out of 10. While I can respect the desire to avoid needless or over-dependence upon the use of technobabble or magic speak and jargon throughout the book, the oversimplification of verbiage and narrative style should also not be hand-wavingly dismissed or excused by the narrator being a young woman, particularly when her dialogue is stiff and unnatural, as well as the dialogue of all the other characters. Outside of this, there's also a quietly annoying habit that Mr. Delarose has regarding the needless reiteration of prior facts and circumstances offered into the narrative. Meanwhile, certain elements of daily life in Rizlandia are introduced prominently, like these weird names, but they aren't given even a brief explanation until 40 to 70 pages later. And in the case of the names, it was explained with a single throwaway line of lore support. You gotta give us something a little bit more than that. Or else it's just seen as annoying and cartoonish and whimsical, and you think you're so clever. It's annoying. Another facet that is irritating is Delarose's imbalanced fashion of vacillating between being deeply detailed with certain individuals, machines, and environments, and then being absolutely bare bones in other places. Consistency is key. If you're not going to be consistent, the reason why you're not going to be consistent should at least be obvious. In other words, don't spend 4 pages describing a room if we're never going to come back to it. Pacing, 6 out of 10. Here we finally come across a category which Mr. Delarose seems to have a fairly sturdy grip upon, and that's to his benefit. Being a brisk and breezy affair of a story, Delarose doesn't linger overly long on any one particular scene, keeping the plot moving along at a decent but not quite rushed pace. Not that it's done perfectly. Frankly, Zyra spends several stretches of the story unconscious, which allows for chunk yardage that feels a little lopsided in a few spots. Add to this the character personality shifts that seem completely contrived because they have little or no explanation, and the pacing starts to feel like it slips where it shouldn't, but overall it still functions well enough. So, conclusion. If we were to do this strictly mathematically, for Steam and Country would come to a 3.5 out of 10. But John being such an egomaniac and so insufferable, I docked half a point to give him a 3 out of 10. When one looks up for Steam and Country's information on Amazon, the data breakdown underneath the title's image indicates that the story is intended for an audience between roughly 10 to 18 years of age or up. This is, in publishing demographics breakdowns, known as the middle grade audience. A few reviews remark that it comes across as a sort of, quote, baby's first steampunk story. Speaking of those reviews, by the way, there's a suspiciously large volume of the 4 and 5-star reviews that are awfully vague or seem to come from folks who are already fans of Mr. Delarose's, or friends or family, or who have almost no other reviews on anything on Amazon, because you can check that under the profiles of the reviewers, which, while not conclusory, is somewhat suspicious. I have a 12-year-old daughter at home, but I think that even she would have found For Steam and Country to be a largely amateur hour example of genre fiction. To his benefit, Delarose accomplishes one of his goals. He provides a mostly wholesome genre adventure for middle-grade readers to step into the fantasy genre generally, or steampunk subgenre specifically. However, with his persistently shoddy writing technique, his unoriginal use of tropes, and characters who are largely forgettable, John Delarose provides nothing here that couldn't be readily and handily outshone by the rank teenage amateurs on fanfiction sites or apps and services like Wattpad. So, even if you could grab it for your own kiddos or yourself as a freebie, I'd have to suggest that most readers go ahead and skip right on by Jen Della Rose's For Steam and Country, because the only thing that it is in terms of steam is a steaming pile. That's my impression. That's my 2 cents. And I really hope that you hear this, John.